Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest edition of our podcast interview series. So remember, as always, we want to make these sessions interesting and as interactive as possible. So please do introduce yourself, tell us where you're joining from, and any other interesting or fun facts. And most importantly, please feel free to add your questions to this conversation. Now, as you well know, today's interview is with the very talented machine learning expert, Michelle Yee. And our topic of the day is navigating the ethical landscape of generative AI. However, before I get to that, I want to share a few quick slides. As always, lots of stuff happening at ODSC and within our community. We do have a free webinar coming up March 12th on the promise of edge machine learning. We've been talking about edge for quite a while now, so I think we're moving closer to that. And then very excited to have Ryan Blue, who you may or may not is the co-creator of Apache Iceberg. And you may also have heard about what what the industry is calling now is open table formats. So we want to do a deep dive into open table formats and see how the effect that's having on the data industry in particular. And we're also, for those of you in the Boston area or want to visit Boston on March 26th, we are back to doing in-person meetups. There'll be two talks that evening. One will be on large language models, again. And the second one will be by yours truly. I'll be giving a talk on how I believe AI is reshaping the venture capital industry. Definitely an industry that needs a bit of a shakeup. And then, of course, we have ODSC East in Boston. So, yeah, as mentioned, ODSC East is back April 23rd to 25th, both in person and virtual. We're going to have an incredible lineup of speakers. One of happens to be Michelle Yee on this podcast and some of our other previous guests. And pretty excited about that. We have free passes available. There's paid training passes available. So go check that out. We just launched the first version of our schedule on Monday. I think we still have about 60 or 70 sessions to add. But I believe there's already the first 120 or 30 on there already. Couldn't be more excited about that. And again, you can join us virtually if you can't make it to the beautiful city of Boston in person. And yeah, and also another thing I'm excited about, we love data science and AI, but something that's very near and dear to my heart because this is how I kind of got my start in the industry was data engineering. And we're co-locating our second annual data engineering summit at ODSC as well. A lot of people don't know about that, but we have 2 days of talks around all things data engineering, which we're quite excited about. So, oh yeah, and sorry, these live streams are converted into a podcast. So we got some very interesting podcasts. I think we've got about 30 now. So if you have a chance on Spotify, SoundCloud, Apple, go check out our podcast series, and this one will be recorded on there as well. So I see lots of people joining already. And let's welcome Michelle. Michelle, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me, Seamus. Glad to be here.
Yeah, glad to be speaking again, Michelle. And you gave a great talk, a very popular one, along with Amy Holder at ODSC West in San Francisco last year. So glad to be chatting again. And by the way, happy International Women's Day.
Woohoo! We couldn't have timed this better. I wish we could say it was intentional, but it just happened to work out.
Yeah, exactly. And Michelle, we know you well at ODSC because we know you're a technology leader specialized in machine learning. And fun fact about Michelle, 15 years experience, and she was contributed to the original IBM Watson Showcase on Jeopardy! And in addition to that, we know you're very passionate about diversity, STEM education, careers for minority communities, and you serve on the board of Women in Data and also a very avid avid volunteer for Girls Who Code, which I'm sure a lot of people know about. But if they don't know these two organizations, fantastic organizations, especially given the day it's in. So go check both of those out. So Michelle, that's just a brief overview, but I would love to have you tell us more about your journey to AI and a little bit more about your background.
Yeah. I'm happy to give a short introduction. But yeah, thanks again for having me, and happy International Women's Day. So for me, academically, by training, I did computer science in undergrad and grad school, and I went straight into AI. At the ripe age of 16, I started my career at IBM Research, and I was fortunate enough.
Wow.
Yeah, I was fortunate enough at that time to join the engineering team that was working on Jeopardy / early days of Watson, which was back then considered, the cutting edge of machine learning, even though deep learning was just sort of like starting to be on the rise. And a lot of it was more like reasoning-based systems and things like that. So that was a great experience. I got to use all the cutting edge tools like mainframe and Fortran and things like that, which I know are super relevant for today. But after that, after Jeopardy aired, I want to say that was in 2011, I left IBM and I really wanted to do more applied machine learning and AI and understand how businesses and people in the industry could actually adopt like cutting edge research and technologies. And so I spent several years in consulting and then went to the startup space where I've been ever since. So that's a short snippet into kind of my overall journey in AI. Oh, you're on mute.
Yeah, I definitely want to cover all those topics. And interesting, would you call IBM Watson the original ChatGPT? Anyway, we can discuss that later. But I do want to move on to the topic of today. So I do follow your work and your postings, and I would encourage people to follow Michelle on LinkedIn or other places we can find, which we can share later in this podcast. But you stated that promoting the participation of diverse voices in generative AI and governance is very important. Can you explain a little bit to our audience why it's important to have diverse voices involved in development and governance of generative AI, and then maybe get a little bit into the challenges of that?
Yeah, I could probably spend like a year talking about this, but I'll try to keep it more concise because I know we don't have that much time. So, I've been a really big proponent of diversity in general. I know it's International Women's Day. I don't just mean gender diversity, but diverse backgrounds throughout the development and life cycle of building AI, whether it's the models or different applications using AI. And that includes because a lot of people I think consider, well, I'm not a data scientist, or I'm not a computer scientist. And so maybe I don't have like a role in terms of AI and the development of AI, but that's actually, we need those kind of people even more, I would argue, than necessarily the computer scientists at some points, right? So if you look at even the development here of Gen AI and sort of the cutting edge that's happening now as we move into multimodal, we really need the voices of people people involved in product, people that are UX or designers, artists, policymakers, writers, right? Because I think that's just the type of paradigm shift that we're having, and it impacts all of us. And so the more that we're missing from different backgrounds, the more challenges that can cause, right? And sometimes I think there's this perspective where, hey, it's either a trade-off of if we incorporate more diverse voices, somehow we have to move slower to market. But the fact is that having diverse voices in the development of AI products builds better products, period. And I think that's true of any technology, actually, not just AI, but it just happens to be that we're focused on AI currently. I think you mentioned sort of what kind of problems typically occur when we don't have diverse voices in the development life cycle or involved, right? Yeah. And this, I think even before Gen AI and foundation models, et cetera, we've seen this historically, right? Even in the Watson days, we actually saw some of this, right? But some of the more famous examples before kind of like the modern, like current era of AI include like, I don't know if do you remember, Seamus, like the gorilla problem? I don't know if you remember that with Google and like the misidentification of certain
Remind me for our audience, in case they're not familiar with that.
So in the early days of, like identification using your phone, object identification, right? There was an incident with where Google misidentified like an African-American couple as gorillas. This was back in the early 2000s, right? And so even back then, we saw kind of like what happens when like diverse voices aren't part of the development life cycle, right? Because a simple unit test would have identified this, right? Somebody from that background, or maybe with like a slightly different ethnic background, would probably have thought about, Q&A, like QA and testing, to be able to identify some of those issues before that made it to production. So there's like, go ahead.
No. Very well said, Michelle. Very well said. Yeah, it's interesting. We saw, was it last week or the week before, with more issues that Google's having with Gemini. But very fair point in terms of not just in AI, but across all technology. Having more diverse voices is very important. And it's interesting because you mentioned a couple of tools there, because there is bringing people onto the team that can have diverse voices and different insights and opinions very important. And then, do you believe there's like current limitations to the tools or techniques used to detect and mitigate bias in these, today's topic, which is generative AI models in particular?
Yeah, so going more into kind of like the modern, like the current stage of Gen AI and foundation models specifically, I think we think about bias in a couple of different ways, like maybe bias as spurious correlation. So like that might be like, oh, we have bias where the data only shows like dogs in outdoor environments. And so this is kind of like a bias in the data set. But when we're talking about like today's topic, I think most of us think of bias as underrepresentation. And so that's sort of, there's like a lot of limitations and tools that try to mitigate those limitations, but there's a lot of challenges, right? So for example, like, let's say, like, especially in terms of underrepresentation, one of the big challenges with current models is sort of how do you handle quote unquote out of distribution scenarios, right? So if 80% of our data is about, it's collected and about, I don't know, North American males, and that's like 80% of our data, and then 20% is like everybody else, then like how do we handle questions, whether that's like in a ChatGPT interface or generating an image or something like this, to handle those types of questions. And so like, and some concrete examples of that might be like, there's a pretty big issue where you'd say like generate images of a computer scientist, and it would be like 10 men sitting in front of a computer that are all Caucasian, Right. And so, but I mean, some alignment work has been done to, and with Gemini, actually, what we saw was like an over-indexing on the opposite, right? On the minor part of the data set, right? And so that's a whole different problem. But then, so there's sort of like these out of distribution issues. Negation tends to be another pretty big issue. So like, generate people that don't have glasses, like you and I both have glasses, but right. So there might be some bias for people who wear glasses, right? Or another one is kind of like, how do we, like there's no way for us to detect if in the original training data set, because like commercial models don't ever put out information, even metadata, about what was actually in the original training data set. Sometimes they put information about the fine-tuning process, like what data was used for fine-tuning, but that's typically very highly curated, and so therefore kind of safer to put out. But the secret sauce is really in that training data set, and there's no tool necessarily that allows us to necessarily like identify, oh, hey, your training data set actually, like for example, the lion data set, which is used for computer vision, actually contained a lot of vulnerable images of children, right? And that were illicit, right? And yeah, and it was identified that that data set was used to go into like stability, for example. And so there's no way though for us to know that up front. And so it's really been kind of like a lot of people reverse engineering and backtesting and jailbreaking models to sort of figure out like what biases are actually in there, because we don't know what training data actually went into training some of these models. Yeah.
No, that's super interesting. I want to take our first question, which is, I believe, a follow-up on that. And I'll just read it out for our podcast audience. And that is, though we have a DPO, which there I believe is direct preference optimization, I believe, and RLHF techniques to deal with security. But I think still generating data to train these kinds of systems can be tough. How do we look at this problem? So is that a generating data question?
Yeah, I guess it is. Are you asking sort of like how do we generate information or generate data to improve models that kind of handle security? Yeah. Maybe you can give us a little bit more context.
Yeah, because what I see is interesting. We had a panel at ODSC West about generating synthetic data, and I think there's a lot of interest in the industry. There's this kind of concept that certain foundational companies, startups have mined all the publicly available information on the web, and now they're looking to private sources and copyrighted sources, and synthetic data to a certain degree will be the savior of the foundational model industry. I'm a little skeptical on that. So maybe that might want to talk about, if we can talk about that. Yeah, what's your view on will synthetic data solve some of these issues we're talking about? To what degree?
Yeah, and I guess like especially in terms of like if you have, for example, something like out of distribution, or like if somebody's trying to jailbreak or something like this, and you're trying to create scenarios or data sets where that might be open source and people could use it to train better models or safer models. But there's a few challenges, at least currently, that we know of. Of course, it's a developing space, but synthetic data, I think there's a lot of challenges in general, because also it's been shown that as more generated data goes out into the wild west of the internet that is today, it actually can end up poisoning a lot of models, right? Because there's also what's called data poisoning, right? And so like synthetic information, so like a lot of synthetic information could be good, but it's also, generally speaking, not good for training models. Where it might be useful actually is like, so Microsoft Research actually came out with a system called Ada, which helps you, it's actually more of like a prompting system. So the synthetic part is like it creates different scenarios for humans to respond to, and then the humans are still generating data in response to like less common scenarios, right? Or like different situations. But the synthetic part is really just that the sort of like this agent is helping you brainstorm what potential security flaws or like out of distribution questions there might be. So I think that's like a creative research approach coming out of Microsoft that maybe helps answer some of that question. But yeah.
No, I think that's great insight. And yeah, because I think what came out of that panel was you have to be very careful with inherent bias when working with synthetic data. That's quite a lot of work there. And speaking of that topic, since we're on it, we kind of, well, at ODSC, we look at a lot of research, as I'm sure you do. Are there any, so sorry, stepping back a bit. So it's interesting what we're seeing with generative AI now, because it felt like with Lime and SHAP and these various tools for explainability and looking what's going on around models, need other organizations contributing to explainability and trying to figure out bias, like there was the IBM AI Fairness Toolkit, but these were almost built for a different generation of AI, right? And now within the industry, I feel like the we need new methodologies for detecting and mitigating bias, especially in generative AI system. Is there anything on the research front or the industry front that you're seeing that's promising for detecting this specifically to generative AI systems?
Yeah, so
Help solve that problem.
yeah, there's a lot of exciting research actually in the space, and I'm encouraged to see more of it coming through. I guess one of them is really around like inclusive text to image sort of generation and tokens. So like I think this paper actually came out from Google Research from, it was hosted at ICCB last year. And it's ITI Gen is the name of the paper, I think. But basically, like their goal was to generate like kind of a set of shared publicly available tokens that would identify kind of like these different hard to match attributes. So like, for example, like the bias for people with glasses, right? Or like different skin tone biases and things like this. And so they were aggregating both like fair data sets, but then also helping create tokens that basically would represent these like less represented features. So that's one that's pretty exciting. I think there's also like in terms of grounding and like mitigating hallucinations, which could also contain a lot of bias and things like that. There's some really cool research and also practical implementations coming out as well. And I'm biased because I've been doing a lot of work with, as you mentioned, Amy, and presenting at ODSC on causal inference and things like that. But another area where there's research being done that combines specifically for generative AI, people might look into Basis Research Institute, which is a nonprofit, and work like that around probabilistic programming and causal inference. So helping us better understand like the reasoning and the actual sort of sources of why predictions are being made versus the more like the pure deep learning data driven approach, which is more black box in general.
No, that's very interesting. Yeah, I've been seeing quite a bit of research around that. You mentioned fair data sets. Definitely don't have time to read all these papers, but fair representation and learning is definitely an interesting one. And yeah, the hallucination part you mentioned is interesting as well, because I've had a few conversations with people about that. So if you look at Claude 3, ChatGPT Turbo, Gemini 1.5, the models are getting so good that 6 months ago, and definitely when they first came out, what was it, May last year, I was checking everything coming out of ChatGPT because I was afraid it was going to hallucinate, right? And it wasn't hallucinating at the time. But what you find is that as times go by, the models get better and better, and they feel like they're not hallucinating. But then the risk factor raises, because now when you're assuming that the models get it right all the time, it seems to me it's a bit of a conundrum, because I'm trusting them more, but they still hallucinate. But we can get into that later, because sorry, if you want to have a comment on that, go ahead, Michelle.
Maybe just a quick comment on that. I think you're spot on. Like the models have been improving significantly. I was really impressed. I recently gave Claude 3 a try, and I was very impressed with it, actually. I think though, like where there's still a lot of opportunity with hallucinations, like because again, like if you're asking general questions, maybe they are performing a lot better. But and maybe also this is tied to the question that we had from the chat, which is like around creating data sets, to mitigate bias, is like when people want to give specific like domain knowledge or something like this to the model, but so you want to ask a more specific question about finance or healthcare or like your own data set, and provide a context on that. I think that's where we still see quite a bit of hallucination and grounding needed, especially if you're using a model to interact with live customers or people. And so like that fine-tuning use case, I guess, could be an area where there's still a lot of opportunity for improvement, and creating the data sets for that may not, like there's a gold standard benchmark that you might want to create, and it doesn't necessarily take like 1 billion data points to do that. So that's just one thought I had.
No, very good. And just looking at the questions here, there's a question from Narek that I also had. And I've heard various results to this question, but if we can display that question. Yeah, what measures can be implemented to enhance the explainability of AI systems without compromising their performance or efficiency?
Yeah, I think this is I guess a lot of people or there's sort of the belief that you can have one or the other, but not both, maybe. But there's a lot of techniques that you can use to improve explainability or mitigate bias without necessarily impacting the model inference or like the model itself in terms of how it's deployed and interacting with other systems or people. And like one of the things that I mentioned earlier was actually like, for example, like as you have the system deployed, like for example, like continuing to improve these out of distribution questions, like collecting more information about that, you can do that in parallel or even upfront, like while you're still doing model development. And actually it would increase your performance, like in terms of accuracy and things like that, because the other case is that like if you have out of distribution questions, not only is it just potential for bias, but it's also a higher likelihood of hallucinating. And so if you mean by performance, like also accuracy, so not just like speed, computational efficiency. Yeah, I think actually doing some of these things that help with explainability and bias mitigation will actually improve your product without compromising its go-to-market or like deployment. So like this sort of like using something like an ADA as part of your development process would actually help. And then there's other things that you can essentially run in parallel, right? Or do like you don't have to do it at the time of inference, right? So like for example, some of these like causal techniques and things like that, you could also run in parallel, or even if let's say you do have scenarios where it's still useful for you to run like Lyme and Shapley. This is sort of like a historical argument, right? Like we heard the same things when Lyme and Shapley came out. But like you don't, like you can also run these kind of things or like feature importance or these classic techniques in addition to the ones for Gen AI in parallel to like whatever system you have running. So from that perspective, like it doesn't necessarily interfere with the model you have in production or your model development. Is something that you can also analyze either like in batches or as part of unit testing, which we should all be doing anyway, right? So things like this that I don't think necessarily harm the efficiency of your model. It only improves it, to be honest.
No, very good insights, Michelle. And we had a podcast, I think it was about 2 or 3 weeks ago. Actually, no, it was 2 months ago. Time flies, with Amanda Roberts from Arise AI, and we were discussing some of the tools and techniques there. I believe was still being able to use classic tools like SHAP and Lyme, and then looking at visualization tools and explainable tools and post-hack ad hoc explanations. And I think from that conversation, one of the open source projects I've been playing around with was Phoenix. I believe it's Phoenix. Yeah, Phoenix. Pretty popular project on GitHub if people want to check that out. Do you have any favorite tools yourself, open source tools or otherwise, that's to help you understand better what's going on in your generative AI models?
Yeah, so I do, in terms of understanding, like I do really like, and it also depends on the model, like, are we talking multimodal, or are we talking like image generation or just text generation, right? Because I think there's different, so just for people who are looking to explore, there's not like a one tool that solves it all kind of thing. So, and so there are like different tools available for different things. I will say, so I think Ada is one that I've consistently mentioned here. Like I really like this paper and project. It's open source through Microsoft Research. And what I like about it in particular is that it's not necessarily some kind of a system that's automating like somehow going to solve like the explainability issue for everything that you're doing, but it's more that it's prompting you, like it's trying to generate scenarios and prompts for you as a human to also answer questions about your data to make the performance better. And then the second one, I guess, for people to check out might be Pyro or Cairo is the next version coming out of Basis, which I really like. And they focus on more like a causal inference approach. And I think that's different and unique to them and like their research approach.
And just lifting this conversation up a little bit, we see a lot of stuff going on in the policy field within the EU, within the US. Do you think the regulators and policymakers can strike a balance between encouraging generative AI? Because we know there's a lot of problems with generative AI with deep fakes and generating quite nasty content and mitigating the many potential risks. Because you mentioned at the very start, you're in the startup world as well. So there's a huge debate around this from both policymakers and industry. But just starting with the policymakers first, and then maybe we'll get into practitioners.
Yeah, I think as usual, the EU is further ahead than those of us in
It's always
here in North
surprising
America.
because the EU is famous for being so bureaucratic. But anyway,
And yet somehow it works that is like advantageous in this particular context. And then and you know, we have seen some AI regulation from policymakers. For example, like the FDA has some regulation around AI usage for like life sciences and drug development, mostly in the discovery process. And I think recently the HHS, or the Human Services and Health Department, they also just started to put out a policy around, starting to regulate like how AI is used when it comes to like daily patient care. And so like people are, I think the policymakers are starting to think about this, but there's also, by the time some of these actually come to paper, there's probably about 5,000 startups that have already gone to market, right? So especially here. But yeah, so I do think there's a big opportunity for policymakers and for us to interact with policymakers, especially like from an open source perspective. So like, for example, I think like early on, I mentioned like this Lion data set, like that contained illicit images of like children and other vulnerable communities. And like that was identified actually by the research and open source community back in like 2019. And it was mentioned like 3 or 4 times across many different papers and like news articles. But it was only recently that through major media news outlets that it came to like a policymaker, more of like a broader regulatory conversation. And so there's opportunity for sure for them to be involved in sort of like, especially when it comes to like vulnerable populations and how we think about curating data, how we compensate people for data and things like this. Without that, I think none of us would be any slower in our development or like innovation were that regulated, right? There's no reason for us to even need that in data. Like some of those are pretty black and white situations, right? So I think there's low hanging fruit and then, increasing in complexity type of problems for them to be involved in.
Yeah, it's very interesting for such a an innovative field. I sometimes the lack of imagination in the policymaker side, because you read about this fantastic research. So when you look at some of the issues with generative AI, so generating deep fake videos for malicious purposes, poisoning chatbots, which you mentioned earlier, generating hate speech, lots of issues, but I can't recall the exact paper. I might have to, or papers, but and also less malicious but still harmful. For example, the use of copyright materials and the effect that has on people trying to generate, create a living. I was just looking at a poll, which you always have to be careful with the results of these. But it was something interesting. It was data from Upwork, and I was a little bit suspicious of it because it wasn't something that Upwork published, and so you always got to be careful of how they scrape that data and how they got that data. But it showed that the image generation creation shot up, and writing went way down. So the amount of hours people were looking for writing and went way down, and the amount of hours for video creation went way up. So you could read that in a positive or a very negative way, which I won't comment on. But then you also hear these techniques like watermarking. So because I'm following very closely the closed source versus open source debate around generative AI. Right. You hear Sam Altman go before Congress and let's close this market. These models should not be open. On the other side of the debate, you have Jan LeCun. We just talked about Jan LeCun and Lex Friedman podcast. I haven't listened to that yet. So you've different side of these debates. I'm squarely on the open source side. I know that comes with risk. And the closed source side, I think it's really a form of market capture. Sure, we'll do all these good things if you just give us control of the market. We've heard that one before. But on the open source side, like there's things like watermarking. And in my mind, because I also, like you, talk to a lot of startups, and I see a lot of promise here, but there are solutions to a lot of these issues with generative AI if the companies producing these models, whether it's open source and most definitely if it's proprietary, do you think the will is there to just put in some of these techniques we read about in research to solve some of these problems? Because some of these problems I view, and again, not trying to disparage people working on this because maybe I'm making it simpler than it is, but do you think there's some low-hanging fruit that could be employed when we generate these generative AI models to do less harm, I guess? Because the generative models do a lot of good. I use them all the time.
I do too.
yeah, as everyone does. So I'm not a huge fan of generative AI models, but on the negative side, I think there can be more. Yeah, sorry. I'll let you answer that question, Michelle. You're the guest.
No. I want to hear the rest of the thought, and then I'm happy to chime in.
No. Well, that's the thought, because my thought is that these companies could do a lot more to mitigate some of these risks than they are doing. They shouldn't be leaving it up to regulators. Like, it's at the end of the day, a certain part of this is a technology problem, like all problems, like a lot of tech problems, the problems in technology that can be solved to a much greater extent than it can be now. Because as practitioners, we focus very much on the tools and techniques for bias detection, fairness and whatnot. But then if you want to track use of these models, there are techniques for making sure that you can trace back who originated these models, which I believe is a lot of the issues we have, right?
Yeah. Well,
any thoughts on that?
Yeah. And well, you bring up a great point about the watermarking. I think that's a really good technology. A lot of that is also available open source to some extent. And I will say, like, if you look at the people publishing some of these original thoughts at least in open science and research, which I am with you, Seamus, like all for open source as well as open research in general. But a lot of these contributions are actually being made by people working at and researchers working at larger companies. So like Adobe and Google, for example, like ITIGen was a Google research paper. And then I know both Adobe and Google have published in the watermarking space in particular. Although I don't know like how, let's say, up to date those are per se, because there's always a bit of a lag between what they publish as research and then like what's been implemented. And so
I believe Adobe has started watermarking.
They have, yeah. And so and that's their whole business, right? It's like art and these sort of like creative assets. And so I do think like there's some effort, but is it enough, to your question? Like, are there the right incentives? I think this is still pretty unanswered, and it goes back to, and you can see how it's unanswered in like the corporate governance structures as well, because there's this question of incentive, like are people incentivized enough to do the right thing, right? And so that's why I think we also see these companies with like really unique structures. Like OpenAI is technically a nonprofit that owns 2 for-profit entities. Anthropic is a B Corp. Yeah, I know. We need a whole other episode for that. But they have
With a
like a
lawyer.
unique situation. Yeah. And then you have like the rise of the B Corp AI entities, right? And so like an Anthropic, and like there's quite a few other labs attempting the B Corp approach. And I think that's really stemming from this question of how do you drive like AI innovation, but still also have incentives built into the structure to do more. So personally, I agree with you that I think there's a lot more that could be done, and there should be more investment in this kind of research and the implementation of the research, because it doesn't matter if you do the research and nobody implements it. But I also think it's on us, even in the open source community, to do more ourselves, because we can't rely on like that to be, and we can't wait, for policymakers or necessarily
Right.
others. So I think it's also on us to grassroots take action. Like I think one really cool tool in this space that I like a lot is Nightshade, which is it's academic, is from the University of Chicago, but they open sourced it, and it was built in collaboration with artists, and it essentially takes your proprietary artwork and it embeds like a layer of changed pixels to make models read it as something completely different. So when the artwork is picked up without your permission, it actually ends up poisoning computer vision models. So, I mean, that's like a community approach to defending yourself.
Yeah, very well said, and a great mention, Michelle. Yeah, I would encourage people to check out Nightshade. The creators behind that are on our target for our podcast list as well as our ODSC list. I think they were a little bit busy for a podcast, and that by the way is now a project that's mushroomed across many different organizations and universities. So that's a really interesting project and holds a lot of promise. And that project in particular has given me a lot of optimism around this whole ecosystem. But I just want to go back to a question which I don't want to directly answer because, but it's something I'm quite excited about and quite concerned about. So in the startup space, we have a small team for another project working on generative AI as well, and we're very focused on agents and getting these agents to work in chain of code, chain of thought, chain of process. And what we always talk about is, when things are going great, they're going great. But you can see with agents have this multiplier effect, right? When they start going bad, they go really bad. And you can see it too in the models, like when they start having biases and data drift and model drift and all these things, it's amplified because you're layering one agent is taking inference from another one, you're amplifying it. And the agent space is a very interesting one because right now, most of industry and most users, they're focusing on a thing. It might be you're using the Gemini Cloud, ChatGPT, Mistral, Llama APIs, and or you may be interacting it through prompts. But the agent space, and I just want to highlight that from Narek, the agent space is definitely going to amplify that, and security is definitely a part of that. I'm not so much worried about the security part of it as I am just about the amplification of, because you can see how people who are very good at doing malicious things can easily get a hold of generative AI. And then once we get better in the agents, because the agents right now, they're pretty crappy. Like anyone, again, without naming agent softwares, because, it's great they're out there because it's just the first version. So I'm not going to say they're bad, but as they get better, and we've seen some pretty big leaps, that's going to be an interesting space. So I do have a follow-up question on that, but if you had a comment on that, Michelle, otherwise I can move on.
I just briefly, I guess, to touch on that. Yeah, I guess, because we also see vulnerabilities. Like it's interesting how vulnerabilities might be evolved or defined as the space also changes. But especially in terms of jailbreaking, like in the case of LLMs and more text-based things, like I think there's a lot to consider there. And in the agent space, I think security is really interesting because we will end up relying, like I don't know if you saw I'm sure you did because you're so on top of these, but like the announcement where Klarna said they automated something like 700 jobs with agents and foundation models.
Just this morning, actually.
Yeah, yeah. It's like hot off the press, right? Yeah. And you have to imagine like, okay, we're going to be relying on these sort of daisy chained, because let's be honest, like right now, a lot of them are quite daisy, like duct taped together systems to
Good way of
be like
putting it.
orchestrated. Yeah, exactly. It's like, oh, a little like, but yeah, we're going to be
That'd be
relying
a
on
great
these.
name for a company, an AI startup, the duct tape AI startup. Wait, don't anyone
Or
grab
daisy
that URL.
chain. Wait, daisy chain. I'm
Daisy
taking
chain,
it.
even better.
No link chain, just daisy chain.
You
But
better act quick. I think some of our listeners are on it.
but like,
Sorry, Michelle, I interrupt.
no, you're good. No, you're good. I was just thinking that like as we start to automate like more complex tasks, right? And if you can do prompt injection or like kind of break into certain points of sort of these decision-making processes, like that can get really complicated because there's so many startups I see doing like automation of infrastructure or things like this. And when you start to get in, or like, I don't know, like insurance processing, right? And something as mundane as this, if it's orchestrated by an agent system that can be exposed to vulnerabilities or attacks, then yeah. But it's a super interesting space. There's a lot of adversarial attacks and defense research also that's really, really fascinating. And we could spend like a whole different session on adversarial attack and defense, actually.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Like motivations are interesting, right? Like look at cybersecurity. I'm motivated to solve the problem. Motivated to solve a problem in cybersecurity because I believe I can build a startup and make a lot of money in that. Like that's one way of looking at motivation. So industry itself tends to get motivated for different reasons. But what about? It's interesting. Those of us who are working in the AI space, we can say that we want to build safe, transparent, fair, generative AI. And you can say that and you can work towards that goal. But are there other ways to motivate practitioners in particular to really be vested in this? Because as we all know, there's a lot of motivations going on when you get up and do your job. A lot of us are not in the research space. This is not a particular problem we're trying to solve. Like the problem we're trying to solve can be something like you just mentioned. We're building chatbots for call centers, and that's our job. And the boss is putting it under pressure. So it's very easy to say we want to prioritize safe, transparent, and fair AI. But any thoughts on how we can do more to motivate the practitioners on this side, or motivate their bosses and their bosses of bosses?
I was gonna say, I think the practitioner may not necessarily be the our challenge, because there's
But they
so
are the
many.
influencer, though. They are the influencer, right?
Yes. Yeah, you're spot on. There's like so many good practitioners that are interested in, but again, like maybe they have X number of hours, and they aren't incentivized to do otherwise. But I guess a couple of thoughts on that. Like in the case, and it ties to a previous question somebody had in the audience. Like in some cases, putting in the effort to work on these problems will actually improve your product and also like the performance of your model, and without necessarily compromising like inference times and kind of like the actual computational efficiency of your model. So I think that's one point. And two, I do think there's a lot of practitioners that want to align incentive models to having a more positive social impact, and also like I think customers, like users like you and I that buy products, like we also have a pretty big role in decision making around that, because we spend our money where where we believe that it's going to have an impact. And so like I do think there's general market pressure to some extent to build better models that are actually having a more positive impact. And then I guess three, which is kind of like the stick versus the carrot, is sort of like if you aren't addressing some of these things, it can really expose your product or company to a lot of liability. Like, for example, if you don't care about like jailbreaking systems, maybe again, not bias specific, but jailbreaking of your LLM or whatever agent you have, it could be like the Ford case where the agent gives away a car for $1, right? So people can convince it and jailbreak it, and you end up losing product because like you didn't necessarily pay attention to like the fact that your system could be jailbroken into, and things like that. And in the case of security, like there's another stick there, right? Like if you aren't looking at how to defend from like adversarial techniques, which some of them are quite fascinating, where like there was one paper that actually did an embedding switch where anytime you like made an inquiry about Trump, it would provide something about Biden. It was really fascinating. Anyway, so systems like there's adversarial, yeah, there's like adversarial attacks that can actually have a pretty big impact on your model from this kind of like security and like perspective. So I think again, like these are all things that can also cost you money, but at the same time, addressing them will also improve like your models from a bias perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. They can certainly cost you money, but generally speaking, it's what we used to take from finance. Your code or your models can blow up the company, right?
Yes.
Especially in quant finance. And I've been saying that about AI a long time now, even before large language models and Gen AI. If you don't do it right, it could be very, very expensive. It's the investment or insurance versus disaster, right?
Yeah.
But let's maybe switch this around a little bit, because let's approach it, like thinking about it from another angle. There's many skeptics in this space around generative AI. Not going to mention Gary Marcus, which is always an entertaining read. We have a newsletter coming out, and I think we're going to do it today. We're going to include the Gary Marcus section, because it's all he always has an interesting take on what's going on in the generative AI world in particular. So let's say I'm a generative AI. I'm building a generative AI model for my company, and I'm presenting it to a skeptical audience. Like they're worried about risk, they're worried about security. How can we effectively communicate the safety measures in places versus the generative AI model's limitations?
Yeah, and I think it's good that people are skeptical, right? But on the other hand, like I also think it's healthy to look at the opportunity. I think like some people are so skeptical that they don't recognize also the opportunity with Gen AI. And of course, in general, I'm still in the field. I really love AI, and I am generally optimistic while still cautious. But we do have to recognize like the potential that the technology has to really help a broad swath of people, hopefully not just a handful, right? And I think that's part of the message that has to be communicated as well, which is like here's an opportunity for, I don't know, everyone with a mind to be a developer. Here's an opportunity for personalized education or whatever it is that you're working on, to genuinely like help a broad group of people in some way. And like while there are certain limitations and challenges, I think it's also important to like stage like let's say you're building your model and you have some safeguards like what because we don't know what we don't know also. Right. So we can't predict every single out of distribution scenario or question that's going to occur. Right. And so I also think part of the communication or like the strategy for deploying models is really also about staging and like understanding, sort of like having a plan for, hey, I'm going to start the rollout with like this more limited use case where maybe the model is just helping me do X portion, right? And you solve some segment of problems or issues, like maybe it's your assistant or research assistant or something like this, but it hasn't like fully automated anything, right? And I think that's sort of like that would ease a lot of concerns that skeptics typically have, right? Because the biggest concern is like you just build it in your, like, I don't know, in your room and you're like, okay, yeah. I built this by myself alone with no input, no community. And then ta-da, now it's in production. All right. And so I think that's really kind of like the gap that a good message and approach to going to market can help with. It's like, hey, I've considered this. Here's sort of like the stage 1 through 4 that I'm thinking of. Here are the safeguards that I have, right? And it solves for these known use cases, and then you kind of incrementally maybe do more. So that might be one approach to help. Yeah.
No, that's very good advice, and also going back to what you said at the very start of our interview here, about adding diverse voices to the work as well, and picking up on that thread, because I know you're very active in this, but in your talking about STEM and education, because part of this is education as well, right? How educated are we around the issues with generative AI? Not just because as practitioners, we tend to just focus on what are the techniques and transformer models I need to build my generative AI model, and what's in my training data, and how do I fine tune it, and very much involved in that. So I think, the educational aspect of it is so important, making people aware of not just how to build these models, but understand some of the issues with them. So, and again, that comes down to what's the education. And do you think there's any programs out there that are encouraging underrepresented groups' participation in STEM education and careers, STEM careers, and particularly in AI? Because I know you're very involved in that.
Yeah. I mean, so huge area of interest for me. I think like even with Women in Data, like which is an organization I know very well, like we do a lot for obviously specific to women, but like in general to many different demographics globally. So it's very international. I think that's the other thing that's generally missing with STEM education, as well as like sometimes it's just very like North American centric or like Western centric. And so having like broader access, or like having materials and content that's more accessible to like the global audience, I think is also something that we could do a lot more work on in general. But that is something that like we, at least in Women in Data, try to do, and hopefully other organizations, because I agree with you, Seamus, that I think there's not enough of that kind of effort going on. And I think in general, like we're sort of in a bubble, like with especially you being more in Boston, and like being in these bigger cities, and like myself in the Bay, I think. So we just kind of assume that a lot of people know, all these things that we're talking about, but the majority actually don't have as much exposure. And so like policymakers, underrepresented people with globally, like don't have the same level of access. And so, I think as much as we can support organizations like Women in Data, or even Girls Who Code, which is also has some data and data science, and now kind of like going into more AI specific education topics, like we need to do more of
Girls
that.
Who Code Girls Who Code is a fantastic organization, and they're in multiple countries as well, right? Or
yes, that's correct.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. No, it's Sorry, go ahead.
No, that was it. I was just saying,
No, and I really admire what you guys are doing there, because from my view, it's interesting, because I think when I started in the startup space in 2013, 2014, I started going to meetups, because a meetup was a great way to get access to knowledge. That's before a meetup. When I first went to my first meetup, it was a technical talk meetup. Prior to that, I was going to a very expensive conference that was just giving me basically a product pitch, or I was going to a technical conference which was way over my head, and in AI, or back then it wasn't even AI or machine learning, things like NeurIPS, way over my head, or just too blue sky, or too far from implementation. And then we had organizations like Meetup come along. There was lots of organizations who were willing to give Meetup space and provide free Meetup space. And COVID has actually killed a lot of that, because we used to talk about democratizing AI before it was cool to say democratizing AI. And our way to do that was we had 60 in-person meetups going across the globe. So we were in India, South America, North America, of course, all over Europe. We had a few going in Africa as well. Not as frequently as we would have liked, but we had that everywhere. And post-COVID, we find that, it's much harder to find space, right? And those who have space want to charge, and you know how this goes. It's so hard to go out and chase a sponsor for beer and pizza. So we're ODSC kind of funds that now just through the conference, and we're looking to get all those meetups back in person because we do a lot of webinars. It's not the same. So, but thinking about that whole democratizing AI and how lots of people jump on that bandwagon. The latest one I hear is that generative AI is going to democratize education, which I'm a little skeptical of. So, what's your view? Do you think that's going to contribute or hinder this goal of democratizing AI, generative AI?
I think it depends on how the founders, or like let's say you're starting a company in that space. But I think it depends like how people prioritize going to market. So one example that I really like is a startup called Atypical. I have no association with them, it's not like I'm trying to plug them for any reason. But I think the one thing that inspires me about them is, so they're trying to do like Gen AI and education space, personalized education space.
Nice.
And what I find interesting about their mission is that, one, they're super diverse, but then two, they also have a core mission of like giving back to the community. So I think as we develop products and companies and things like that, like having some component that, like, I don't know if it's a free offering that goes to like public schools versus, things like this, or like certain types of schools or audiences. I do think that's really important because otherwise we will just continue to have the same problem that we've been recreating generationally, and not really having a democratization of anything, right? It'll just be like, okay, people who have the GPUs can afford to do this, and that's it. But I am optimistic about personalized education and people having more broader access to, like, I don't know, even interacting with a coding assistant. Like these are things that with some of the Girls Who Code curriculums, like I also introduce them to. And so I am optimistic in general about like this helping people to learn, but it's sort of like, how do we make sure that everybody knows that these are tools that can help you to learn, right? And so it's just about awareness and education. So hugely thankful to platforms like, and organizations like ODSC as well, where like that is made a lot more accessible to people.
Yeah, and in some respects, haven't seen the democratization of data science, AI data, in the lens of the last decade now. There are some very well funded organizations out there who do a good job in that as well. But I think the challenge now is that generative AI startup sounds fantastic, and I'm actually having worked with educational startups myself, and in that space, and public schools. It's an area I'm very interested in. But I think across the board, and organizations are doing a really good job of that. But I think the challenge now is not just the educational side of it, but also the path to careers in AI, right?
Yes.
And I know women in data does a good job of that, and Girls Who Code also doing that as well. But that's where the challenge is, and I think that's where the larger industry needs to get behind this, because to me it's all connected, right? Because before you said, well, it was an educational problem. Well, that to a certain degree it has been solved or is being solved.
Yeah.
And when I looked at some of the larger organizations, I don't need you to help us give us yet another free webinar on how to build generative AI models. What you need to be able to do is having an internship program or a larger program to get these underrepresented groups into jobs and positions where they can build meaningful careers in this space, right? As opposed to, I hate to use the term we use in finance, greenwashing, but it's a little bit like that. So I think that's a challenge. Yeah, I'm not sure if you have anything to say about, if you had any comment on that, but like to me, democratizing AI is not just about education, it's also about giving people a clear path to a meaningful career in the AI space, because we need more people in the AI space. And yeah, because I know you're a board member of Women in Data. Today is International Women's Day. Do you see the role of women in AI in particular, especially in leadership positions, shaping the future of generative AI? Like, what's your view on that?
I think you're spot on in terms of like, it's a life cycle, right? Like you can't just drop like, okay, we've educated them and then we're done. Like, we're like, oh, right. And I do agree with you well that there's a lot of, I guess, like DEI in general, like programs that were so popular even the last couple of years ago are now, I would say, kind of under attack. I've even seen some articles where like there was a VC that was focusing on like supporting funding underrepresented founders, and like they were getting sued. And so I've seen like a lot of, I would say, like backlash against these types of programs sometimes. Again, not everybody, but in some instances. Yeah. And I do think there is a pretty big gap. Like, and also when I was co-founding, for example, like I think less than 2% of VC funding goes to female founders. And so there's, especially at the leadership level, but then also I would say in that like mid-career kind of like transition, and people who are also trying to move into like a more of an AI-oriented career, whether that's technical or product management or whatever it is. I do think there's still a really big gap. And there's like, I mean, there are organizations trying to bridge this gap. Like, at Women in Data, we work with a lot of corporate sponsors and folks to like do connections between internships and job boards and things like that. But there's a lot more that I think we need to do. And it's quite frankly a gap. And I don't know about you, Seamus, if you've seen improvement. I feel like after COVID, it's kind of like regressed in some ways.
Yeah, well, that's exactly what I was trying to say politely.
Yeah.
I feel like it's regressed. And in a certain degree, and to a certain extent, just this whole excitement around LLMs and Gen AI and just the rush into the market. Some of the goals that were going in the right direction have fallen to the wayside as we figure out this latest problem. And I understand that, a new focus, new set of problems. So it's very, very interesting. And so again, Michelle, fantastic insights, some great advice, and I would encourage our listeners to follow you. So what's the main way for people to follow you, apart from coming to ODSC, which I encourage you to do, meet Michelle and even myself in person. But where are you speaking these days? Where are you posting? Mostly on LinkedIn, I believe.
Yeah, mostly on LinkedIn. I do some writing on Medium and things like that for longer technical posts. But if you're interested, feel free to connect on LinkedIn. And that's probably the easiest way to find me and where I'm speaking next and all of that. So
excellent. And I know you're teaming up with Amy Holder again. You'll be speaking at ODSC East in in mid-April there on the. It is a generative AI topic, right? Sorry, I don't have the whole.
Yep, it would be about. No, you're spot on. It's explainability specifically, and we'll be talking about causal inference again. Yeah.
Perfect. So apologies to those of you who want us to do a deeper dive into this, but head to Boston and trust me, you will not be disappointed. Amy and Michelle always give a fantastic talk. Always one of our best rated sessions at ODSC. And thanks again to our audience. And I love the fact that some of the folks on our audience were answering questions for each other. That's exactly what I want to see, because this interview was so insightful that we ran over by 10 minutes. So I really apologize to everyone to not getting to all those questions. And there's plenty of good questions out there. So reach out to Michelle or myself if you still have questions. But Michelle, thank you so much for being such a great sport, coming on the podcast. We'll see you at ODSC East, and thank you again. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much, Seamus, and appreciate the opportunity, and happy International Women's Day.
Yes, and you too, of course, always.
Cheers.
Bye for now. Okay, everyone.